We've been talking a lot about process, but we haven't really talked about what a process is. And one way we can get at that is to look at some standards for what processes should be. So we're going to start in this video by looking at the ISO-9000 series of standards. And they are standards for what a quality management system should be, but it's really all about process. So the ISO-9000 is actually a series of standards. The first, ISO-9000, is really just the definitions of what a quality management system is. ISO-9001 takes those definitions and talks about how you do that in real life. And ISO-9001 is special because a company can be certified as meeting ISO-9001, which means that experts have come in and looked at how they are managing their processes, and they are managing them in a way that meets that standard. ISO-9004 talks about how you maintain an attitude in an organization that is focused on continuous improvement, and that's from a management perspective. And then there is ISO-19011, which are the guidelines for an auditing system, which is kind of how you're tracking to make sure you're doing what it is that you're supposed to be doing. So in this video, I'm going to talk about ISO-9000. Maybe a little later in the semester, we'll talk about ISO-9001. So ISO-9000 specifies what a quality management system is. And so it starts out with some basic concepts and some background information. And then there's a chapter that is the definition of what is a quality management system. And essentially, a quality management system is the things that you do to make sure that you are building what you need to be building. So the first aspect of that the document pays attention to is management's responsibility for that process. So the people who are doing the job have some responsibility, but management has some responsibility for attitude and control of the quality management system. Then there is a section on resource management, which is how do you make sure that you have all of the things that you need to build what it is that you want to build. So how do you get stuff from your suppliers? How do you manage your inventory? How do you make sure you have enough human capital to do what it is that you want to do? All of that resource management, how you do that is part of ISO-9000. Now, the part where engineering fits in is the section that is called product realization. And that includes everything from figuring out what it is that we need to build, to making sure that we build it, arranging things to get the right things from our suppliers, making sure that what we build meets the criteria that we need it to meet. All of those things are part of product realization. And I'm going to go into some more detail about that in this video. And then the last section is measurement, analysis, and improvement. And essentially, that last section is statistical process control. So all of the rest of the stuff that we do this semester has to do with that section of ISO-9000. ISO-9000 is talking about a quality management system. But what it really is an argument that a quality management system is really a process for monitoring and improving your processes. So the idea here is that there is a standard way that we go about making sure that we are following the rest of our processes. In order to do that, ISO-9000 says the first thing is you have to have a documentation of what those processes are. And then while you're doing the things, you have to be gathering data, first to make sure that you're following the process, but second, because we can use that data to better understand the process. And then when we make improvements, when we make changes to the process, we think we're going to make improvements to the process, but we also use that data that we're gathering to evaluate, was a change a positive improvement? Because sometimes you think something is going to make things better, and then it turns out that it really doesn't make things better. So the product realization section of ISO-9000 is really where engineering sits. But this section talks about all of the things that have to happen in order to produce a product. And so it talks about how do you plan for product realization, There are a bunch of processes that have to do with customers. How do you keep track of your customers? How do you keep track of the problems that they're having? How do you make sure you delivered what you wanted to deliver? All of those are customer-related processes. Design and development is where engineering sits. And then there are also product realization standards and standards for how you produce and service the things that you produce. And then there is some control and measuring and monitoring of devices. So that might be monitoring the equipment in the manufacturing process and measuring the things at the end to make sure that they are built the way they're supposed to be built. So engineering sits in the middle of this. We are design and development. So the first thing that the standard talks about in design and development is essentially control of the design and development process. So this says that you have to plan your development, that your development has to be, before you even start, you have to know what are the stages of design and development that are going to happen, what's going to be done in each one of those stages, how do you know when you're finished with those stages. So your design and development process has to be specified in stages. There has to be some plan for review and verification of the activities to make sure that you are following your plan. There has to be a standard way in which you assign responsibility and authority for all of the different things that happen within the process. You have to manage the interfaces between your organization and other parts of the company. And if you divided your organization into subparts, how do those different parts talk to each other? And finally, you have to make sure that you have a plan and that that plan stays up to date. So if something changes in what you're going to do in your process, or in what your requirements are, or in what your deliverables are going to be, the plan has to be kept up to date. Now, I know there is an awful lot of information on this slide, but you have a pause button. You can use that pause button to stop and read all of the details on these slides. So the next thing that ISO 9000 talks about relative to design and development are what it calls design and development inputs. But essentially, these are all of the rules that tell us what it is that we're going to have to build. So the first part of that are the functional and performance requirements of what we're going to build. These requirements just specify what is the problem that we're going to solve and what are the characteristics that a solution would look like. Then there's a chance that we will need statutory or regulatory requirements to be met. If we are doing embedded software development in, say, something like a car, then we're going to need to follow the MISRA-C standards for how you do C coding in embedded systems. If we're going to make electronics something that can go into somebody's house, perhaps they have to be UL certified, whatever the statutory and regulatory requirements for this project are going to be. The third thing that we're going to specify is information from previous designs. 9 times out of 10, you're not designing something from scratch. You work for a company who has built similar things before, and there's information to be gleaned from those prior products. And so you should see what information you can gather from previous designs that you'll be able to leverage in this design. And then there may be other essential requirements that are not functional or performance, or not statutory or regulatory. Maybe your company, everything always has a blue landing page, or there is a product family kind of thing for what something needs to appear to be. Whatever other requirements are those other essential requirements. And the last thing is, not only do we have to be able to list all of these different kinds of information, but we also have to have a process in place for reviewing those documents and making sure that they are complete and consistent. The outputs of design and development are essentially the specifications for what it is you're going to build and the process for how you build it. Essentially, it's all of the things that engineers create. In this portion of it, the ISO-9000 says that you're going to make sure that your design output meets those requirements that we figured out at the input. We're going to have information about where do you purchase all of the components for it, how do you put it into production, and what does it take, service provision is, what does it take to get it installed for a customer. You're going to define acceptance criteria, which is essentially what does it take to make sure that your product is legitimate. What are the things that it must do in order to have successfully built it. And then there has to be a process for how you approve those outputs. Somebody reviews to make sure that the outputs meet the criteria that were specified in the inputs. So ISO 9000 recognizes the importance of design as part of product realization because they put a whole section that is just on design reviews. So engineers create designs. They may be documented in a CAD diagram of some sort, or in a piece of code of some sort. But essentially, what engineers are producing is designs. And that is so important to making sure that we realize the product that we're trying to realize, that ISO 9000 requires that we conduct design reviews. And we're reviewing the quality of the design and the likelihood that it will fulfill the requirements to solve the problem that we set out to solve. And they even have a rule that is about who participates in those design reviews, and how those design reviews are documented. The last part of design and development in ISO 9000 is design verification. This is essentially how do you make sure that what you built actually meets the requirements that you got as inputs. So this is a plan for what tests will you run, and how will you, and how does the device or software or component have to behave in those test situations. And it requires not only that you plan that verification, but also that you document what happened during that verification process in some pretty gory detail, because that will not only verify that you met the design, but it gives you some safety if later on people say your design does not meet the requirements. And if you don't meet the requirements, then that'll give you insight into what you need to do to change your design in order to make it meet the requirements. So the big picture here is that ISO 9000 is very concerned about the inputs to the engineering process. Those are making sure that you know the requirements for what you're going to build and what the goals of the project are. What is it that will let you know that you did it right? And then they sort of leave engineering as a kind of black box. But they say the output from engineering is a design, and that is documented in some sort of way. That design then has to go through some very careful design review and verification to make sure that what you built met the rules in the inputs. So you're making sure that the output meet the criteria of the inputs. And if they do meet, then okay, design is done, and we can, the product can be released to the customer. If they don't, then things feed back to engineering, and we have to fix those things in order to make the outputs meet the requirements of the inputs.